everybody, and welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Carbo Lemons.
Carbo.
Today we're going to be talking about William Walker, the filibuster. William Walker was a man with a dream of a better, stronger America. An America expanding to fill the continent down through Mexico into South America, an America with an ever-growing list of new states. And in every single one of these states, Walker dreamed that slavery would be legal.
Sounds like a great dude.
Here's the plan that William Walker has. You need to understand the climate of the time here in the mid-1800s in America. There is this political balance that has happened in the U.S. based on the fact that we formed a union. We didn't get rid of slavery because if we had, there wouldn't have been a union. But a lot of people are like, this slavery stuff, super gross. And the people who have the slavery stuff are like, we love the slavery stuff. It's amazing. And so they keep walking this tightrope back between, we're not going to get rid of it. We don't want to give the people with slaves too much power, though. And as states enter the union, it's perpetually an argument, is this going to be a slave state or not? If you get too many slave states, the people who are anti-slavery are worried that eventually the entire Senate and Congress will be loaded with people who are pro-slavery, so that position will take over. They don't want that. The people who are in the slave states want exactly the opposite thing. They say more anti-slave states, that's not good either. That means that people are going to be voting against us. We know you guys hate this slavery stuff because of your quote-unquote morals or whatever, so, we better have a good balance here. And William Walker's plan is to tip this balance in favor of slavery by just conquering some places and having them be part of the U.S. Now, it's important to understand that in this time period, this is not the craziest idea. It is not a good idea. It is not a moral idea, but from the perspective of doability, you can at least understand why William Walker thinks he can pull this off. Because there are states constantly being added to the Union, most notably Texas. Texas had become a new state founded on land won in a war with Mexico in 1845 when Walker was only 21. And at that time, the country itself had only existed for 70 years. So the America that we know today was still very much in formation, in flux, not formed. There was no sense of the limit of what America could become. If someone claimed that the U.S. would one day take over all of Mexico or Canada or even the entire continent of South America, there was no sure way of knowing how unlikely that was.
I mean, there were attempts to take Canada at a point anyway, so it's like, that was prior to this, I'm pretty sure.
It is prior to or around the same time. There's attempts to expand further north. There are attempts to expand further south. And you have to understand, Mexico, not a massive power at this point, especially in some of the areas that would have been contested. We're talking about desert, and it's pretty sparsely populated anyway. Canada, basically the same thing. It's still not a massive country, so invading it militarily would probably be not that big of a deal, but it's not worth really poking the British too much. But for a pro-slavery activist like Walker, having states where slavery was already legal applying for citizenship, for inclusion in the Union, seemed like a really good idea and a great way to tip the balance of power in Washington. And just in case you're wondering how pro-slavery was this guy really, you can read his writings and he's super, not even a little bit shy about talking about how great slavery is and how important it is and how morally good it is for everybody involved.
Morally good, huh?
Boy, yeah. Now, William Walker was no slouch. This guy graduated from college at the top of his class at the age of 14. Now, he did graduate from the University of Nashville. It's not like he went to Harvard or something, but still, that's pretty smart. And throughout his life, he tried his hand at being a doctor, a lawyer, and a journalist. But in 1853, at the tender age of 29, he decided his true calling in life was invading other countries by himself.
Him and Gregor McGregor would have got along real well.
I was thinking about that a lot when I first started researching this, especially. And since he's living in San Francisco at the time, Mexico seemed like the obvious best place to start. Unlike Gregor McGregor, everybody knows where Mexico is. They know it's a real place. You just get a bunch of people to come with you and invade Mexico, and then you have a new state in Mexico. And his first tactic to invade Mexico is to ask the Mexican government for permission to invade Mexico. He goes to the Mexican government and he's like, man, there's a lot of problems with the Indians coming over the border from your country, and here's my idea. We're gonna bring a bunch of people over, and we're just gonna kind of create a little fort, little buffer zone where we'll all live, and it'll be fine. We won't. I promise we're not gonna set up our own colony or anything. We're gonna live here in this fort, and it'll be good. And Mexico, having just lost Texas and knowing exactly what's going on here, they're like, no, go away. This is not cool. Now, Walker is undeterred by this, and he moves on immediately to planning a military invasion, again, by himself. And he recruited like-minded men to his cause, raising money by selling off the rights to the land he planned to conquer.
Man, this was just an era where people were kind of brazen about this. It's like, I'll raise my own military, go take a country of my own, and you can buy stocks in us, or you can buy land with it.
Yeah,
like,
it's wild too.
Get it on the ground floor.
I got the sense that he was selling these stocks in his invasion to the people who were going to help him do the invading. It's like, here, pay me to help me go take this land. But that's...
So he didn't even have to pay his army in some instances, I'm sure.
He's wildly popular. And this is something you're going to need to understand for the whole of this story. There are people who just straight up love William Walker, and a lot of them, especially in the southern states, especially if you're pro-slavery like William Walker is. You're reading what William Walker is saying, you're on board with his plan, and you're going to go and you're going to take some land in Mexico. And he goes and he gets all of his guys together and he rents a ship and he's ready to set off to invade Mexico, and he gets arrested. Some killjoy named General Ethan Allen Hitchcock is like, it is illegal to invade other countries when you're not the country that is invading. Yeah. You can't just go do this.
And also you need congressional approval, etc., etc. There's about 17 reasons why that's a terrible idea.
Yes. In addition to the fact, on top of just the sheer audacity and stupidity of this plan, there's also a treaty that's been signed with Mexico where it's like, we're not going to invade you guys. So he's going to be breaking this treaty. But I'm going to remind you again, William Walker, insanely popular. And General Ethan Allen Hitchcock does not do well in this exchange because everybody, including the officials in California, all the way up to people in the State Department, say, no, give him back the ship, man. This is not cool. You have to give William Walker back the ship that he rented to go invade Mexico. And the Secretary of War at the time, who just so happened to be a man named Jefferson Davis, relieves Hitchcock of his command over this incident. Now, I've read some details in this. It may have been that he didn't directly replace him, but he refused a request for medical leave from Hitchcock later. But regardless, Hitchcock ends up taking the short end of the stick, retires to like Arkansas, and spends the rest of his life studying alchemy. Story's not about him. Dude was fascinating, though.
There was a lot of different fascinating people in this in just the first few minutes you've talked about. Like Jefferson Davis, for people who don't know, became the president of the Confederate States.
Oh, yes. I just assumed everybody did know that, Tony, and I don't want to talk
from the South.
Down to people, but yes, he would eventually go on to be president of the Confederacy, which is why you might imagine he would be in favor of this guy trying to create more slavery stuff. Walker, now a free man, again, now with the ship again, proceeds with his plan to occupy Sonora, Mexico, renaming it the Republic of Sonora. And as any good republic would do, you just install yourself as the president. They don't need to have a vote yet or anything. And he accomplished this feat with only 45 men. But declaring yourself the leader of a sparsely populated Mexican territory turned out to be a lot easier than actually holding that territory, and Walker proved himself to be a poor leader. His supply lines were quickly lost, and he was forced to retreat back to the United States, where he was arrested again. But William Walker is insanely popular, and so he goes to trial. And there was an interesting little detail where they just arrest him and then they let him go on his own recognizance, and he walks back to San Francisco and stands trial there, and the jury was super sympathetic to his cause, and again he goes free. He's like, yeah, America, strong! Boy, I'm just like those guys at the Alamo with the Texas, and then slaves are great. We need more of those. And now Walker is famous. He has failed in his attempt. Right? He's tried to go to Mexico. He's tried to carve out Texas 2.0. It didn't work, but people know who he is, and people outside the country know who he is now. And so in 1854, he was approached with an invitation from some Nicaraguans, hoping that he would try his hand at invading their country. Nicaragua had been fighting a civil war for years, and the country was in shambles. The population of Nicaragua at this point, because so many men had been killed in this civil war, was 1 man to every 7 women. So they're super...
It's a great time to be single in Nicaragua, though.
I guess. Yeah, and women love a man in uniform, and all the men are in uniform.
They'll probably be a widow later, but still.
The Democratic Party of Nicaragua wanted Walker's help defeating the stronger Legitimist Party, and Walker was only too happy to oblige. Nicaragua's Democratic President Francisco Castellón authorized Walker to bring 300 quote-unquote colonists to settle in his country and help him defeat the Legitimists. Now, this is a situation where president is this guy's title technically, but they're in a civil war, so he's calling himself the president. The Legitimists have their president. The capitals are moving around. There's a lot of stuff in flux. You don't want to pin down anybody too much to their title, because as we're going to see, basically anybody can say, I'm the president, and get away with it for a while anyway. Walker was initially only able to recruit 60 men, but he set sail for Nicaragua anyway. When he arrived, he set to work conquering the country. His tactic of conducting every battle as a direct frontal assault did nothing to mark him as a savvy military strategist, but he was nevertheless eventually successful in taking the legitimist stronghold of Granada. And this is holdover from the last thing that he tried to do. This man is not a genius military leader. He just has his guys charge in and shoot their guns and try to take whatever. And he's successful because Nicaragua is in such shambles that these sort of more enthusiastic, better armed, better fed Americans are able to overrun them without too much trouble. And I'm not going into the details. There's several different battles that happen. There's counterattacks and things. He loses a couple things, but he does eventually take the stronghold, the capital city, or at least the recognized capital. You know, again, capital's moving around a lot in this time because of how things are going. At this point, Walker made his biggest tactical mistake. Now, for those of you who are real bad at your geography, and that includes me, as you will know if you heard last week's episode, Nicaragua is at a choke point in South America. It's right in that skinny area where eventually, close to this, they would build the Panama Canal in Panama. But at this time, one of the most popular ways to get your stuff from one side of the country to the other was, instead of shipping it all the way down past the bottom of South America, you would ship it down to Nicaragua, you would tote it overland, you would put it back in a boat on the other side, on the Pacific side, and then you would ship it the rest of the way to California.
Definitely sounds more efficient than traversing an entire continent.
Right, which is why we eventually dug a canal. There were actually plans at this time to maybe dig a canal in Nicaragua. Doesn't happen, but the person who is in charge of this shipping interest, the Accessory Transit Company, just so happens to be a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt. And Cornelius Vanderbilt is the most rich person in America at this time, and one of the most powerful.
I'm guessing that Vanderbilt University is named after him or his family.
I don't know for sure, but that is a super safe guess, Tony. And what Walker does is he takes control of this shipping point, this choke point where Vanderbilt's company has built up a transit across the land so that they can ship things faster to the Pacific area. He takes control of this and gives it to some of the lower level managers of the accessory transit company. These guys were people who had helped him in the war, and they knew that their days as managers were numbered. So since they had helped this guy who was essentially taking over the country, they just said, "Hey, how about a favor, boss?" And the boss was like, "Yeah, that belongs to you now. All those ships, those are your ships. Cornelius Vanderbilt not doing good stuff with them. You do good stuff for me." And Cornelius Vanderbilt was not happy. And he immediately set to work looking for a way to unseat Walker. Unaware that the richest man in America was now plotting to take him down, Walker continued consolidating power in Nicaragua. At first, he wielded his influence through a weak government of local Democrat leaders, but when he ran into problems getting them to comply with his plans, he eventually made himself the president. And because more and more Americans kept flooding to Nicaragua to support Walker, there was little the weakened populace could do to stop him. Now, as Walker was maneuvering to become president of Nicaragua, the American Secretary of State, William Learned Marcy, yes, his real middle name was Learned, sent a liaison up from the State Department down to Nicaragua to establish diplomatic ties with the government. Now, at the time that Marcy sends this liaison, everything is still up in the air. There is still this puppet government. They're not really sure what's going on with them. He's just sending this guy to try to kind of make contact and see how things are going. But as this ship is sailing to Nicaragua, William Walker seizes power and declares himself the president. And so when the American liaison gets there, William Walker is now declaring himself to be the president, and the guy who they sent was a man named John Wheeler. And John Wheeler shows up in Nicaragua. He finds Walker already declaring himself to be the authority in Nicaragua, and Wheeler just so happened to be an old friend of Walker's. They had lived across the street from each other in Nicaragua, and they had visited each other's houses a lot, and Wheeler just decides, well, I've got these orders that say that I am going to establish contact with the government. You're claiming to be the government, and I like you. You're pretty cool.
So he's just propping up legitimacy to his cause.
He just shows up and he says, you know what? I've got the power to say that you are indeed the president. That's how I interpret my orders from the State Department. Now, this is not a direct decision by the president at this time, Andrew Pierce. I don't have a lot of love for Andrew Pierce. He seems to be a pretty sucky president, but I will point out the Wikipedia page claims that Pierce recognized Walker's legitimacy, and he did indirectly through the fact that he was the head of the State Department, and the State Department sent this guy, and this guy went down and recognized Walker's legitimacy. But Pierce did not ever decide personally, yeah, this guy who invaded Nicaragua, he's cool, he's the president. I think it's a little misleading to have that in the Wikipedia page. And to further cement the fact that Pierce was not on board with this, at the same time that John Wheeler is sailing down to Nicaragua on behalf of the State Department, there's another man who's sailing back from Nicaragua, being sent as an ambassador on behalf of the government underneath of Walker. Walker sends one of his supporters. I forgot the guy's name. I didn't put it in my notes, but this is also one of these just crazy characters. I mean, all these people are crazy and a little bit exciting. Like, you can understand why people got excited about this. The slavery thing, still super bad. Still uber super bad. But the idea of like one guy just going in and being like, I own this country now. There's something about that's going to get a certain segment of the population, on your side.
Yeah, so it's all about that American brashness sometimes.
Yes.
It's like going over there and taking what you want. There's confidence there. There's power.
So he sends this man back to Washington, where the people in Washington are like, "You're who? From where? From President what now? No, you're not a real ambassador. We don't accept this." So there's a lot of confusion that's mostly a result of the fact that they don't have instantaneous communication at the time. So they're just a lot of fog of war. But this is the point where Cornelius Vanderbilt manages to strike back. And he does it with the help of Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. Those three countries surround Nicaragua, one on one side of Nicaragua, two on the other. And they're not cool with this American who's just showed up and declared himself the ruler of a whole country right next to them. And they're a little nervous that maybe he's going to try it in their country.
It's a pretty probable thing, I would think. Like, especially if he got established that he would just be trying to grab up other states.
Well, spoilers for this story at the end, but he ends up going back to Honduras to try this again. We'll get to that in a little bit. But they all throw in together to try to overthrow Walker. And they get help from Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Cornelius Vanderbilt is a man who has built his empire and his fortune on shipping, and he knows a thing or two about logistics and supply lines. And he dispatches 2 secret agents to the government of Costa Rica specifically to advise them on how they can cut off Walker's supplies and starve out his troops. Once again, Walker proved to be a poor leader both militarily and otherwise, and he was eventually pushed out of Costa Rica. But not before instructing his men to raze the historic city of Granada to the ground, leaving behind only an inscription which read, "Here was Granada."
That's just spiteful and stupid.
It was spiteful and stupid.
It's like, what's really the point? You're just having sour grapes because you ended up losing.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you know this. Sometimes people can be petty and mean. And this was the oldest city in South America at the time. So raising it to the ground, it's not like just any city. It was very historically significant. So he's being extra super petty. He's not just destroying people's homes. He's destroying a piece of history. Now, in his defeat, Walker was arrested by one Commodore Hiram Paulding, and he was sailed back to the United States, where he surrendered himself to the U.S. Marshal in New York. Once again, someone who personally was a great admirer of Walker.
I just wonder what it takes to get notoriety at this time. It's like there's so little communication, so the newspapers must have really latched on to anything of interest with him.
Well, it's an exciting story, you have to admit. Like, it's not the kind of thing you're not going to report on, right? There's a lot of boring legislation stuff that's probably happening, and then there's a guy who's invading Nicaragua on his own. And whether or not you're for him or against him, it's at least the kind of thing that you can't look away from.
It's definitely going to sell some newspapers.
And Walker's situation falls once again into weird legal gray areas. Despite the fact that he 100% did do this invasion of another country, there's a kerfuffle over the fact that people argue over whether Hiram Paulding was technically allowed to arrest him, because he was the leader of another country and he wasn't on American soil at the time. So there's that legal problem. And there's the fact that any jury you put this guy in front of is just going to eat up everything he says and acquit him anyway. And Walker does eventually walk free. He's acquitted of his crimes, and he writes this book about his adventures and defends his position and talks about how great slavery is. You can go and read this stuff for yourself. A lot of the stuff written about this guy, by the way, is fascinating. I recommend a book, which I believe is in the public domain. It's available on archive.org, called Filibusters and Financiers. Filibuster, by the way, at this time meant pirate or freebooter, which was what they called these people who had this strategy. William Walker isn't the only one who thinks to try this. He's just the most successful. But they gave these guys who were like, I'm going to go invade somewhere. They called them filibusters.
Yeah, not apparently like the filibuster that takes like 20 hours of somebody just talking in front of Congress.
Well, that meaning came from the same idea, right? It's like, oh, you're kind of taking over. That's like kind of legal and kind of not, and you're sort of using this weird rule to get what you want, even though that's not really how it's supposed to work. That's, I think, where the idea of the filibuster as a political process comes from. But after Walker wrote his book, he once again sets off, and this time he goes to Honduras, as I mentioned. And he is almost immediately apprehended by the British. And the British, very wisely thinking to themselves, we're not going to send this guy back to America. Because he's been arrested 3 times now. And every single time they're like, yeah, but it's William Walker. Everybody loves William Walker. Let's let him go. We're going to release him to the Honduran authorities. And the Honduran authorities did not love William Walker, who had tried to invade the country right next to there and fought a battle against them. So they shot him. They just had him killed. And that was the end of William Walker and his pro-slavery expansionist plan.
It's like, whenever a country just gets a shot at him like that, then I'm never surprised when they're like, well, this is a very easy solution. We're not going to put him through trials. We're just going to, take him out back.
I mean, if there was a trial, right? Like it wasn't like they just shot him, but it was definitely one of those things where it's like, yeah, no kidding. They shot him. It was a firing squad and it was quote unquote legal, but a lot of the stuff that Walker did was quote unquote legal too. So, you get what you pay for, I reckon.
Central America was a wild place during this time.
It really was, and it's so fascinating to read this guy's own account of himself and the account of the people after him. There is this really weird kind of cognitive dissonance you get into where on the one hand you're like, man, this guy like went out and just like tried so hard to reach and grab a hold of his dream. And then you're like, remember, oh right. And the dream was to expand slavery so that it took over the entirety of America and then the world. So not such a great dude.
Some dreams are best left to die in a field in Honduras.
But that is it. That is the bad idea for this week. It's slavery mostly, and also invading other countries by yourself, especially if you're this guy. Like, you're not Hernando Cortez, right? I've read his biography. That dude did essentially the same thing for similar reasons. Mostly he was trying to spread his religion. But, at least he was a good military leader. This guy thought he was hot stuff. Wasn't a dummy. Got a lot of support from people in America. But ultimately, he got the end that was coming to him.
Yeah. He was more charismatic than he was talented.
Absolutely. And that's a dangerous combination. I'm glad it ended badly for William Walker.
Me too.
I highly recommend reading as much as you can about this era, though. I was so thankful to be able to research this and find so many interesting characters interacting in such a bizarre way. I never really conceptualized this period of history being like this, of exactly how much in flux everything was and how you could have this kind of plan to just become a president of a country, not your country, just take over somewhere. It's maybe a testament of the idea that you never know what you can do until you try.
A little bit.
But again, not a great thing to apply to expanding slavery.
Yep.
That is all we have for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, and I hope you did, I hope you enjoyed it half as much as I enjoyed researching it, you should click on that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories like this. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes, where we release these a week early, and we have a lot of other cool content for you guys as well. We will see you guys next time with another bad idea.
Bye, everybody.